Welcome to those who are joining us for the first time, and welcome to our monthly scholars. Welcome to Part 3 of Dr. Thomas Hawke's lecture, Sun, Snow, and Seals, Studying Seals to Save Humans. This is the final portion of Dr. Hawke's lecture. To recap, in Part 1 of Dr. Hawke's lecture, we were introduced to Antarctica. We learned about how Antarctica was discovered and about the unique terrain, climate, and wildlife there. In Part 2, Dr. Hawke shared photos and stories about what it was like living in Antarctica during the time he conducted research there. And today, in the final portion of Dr. Hawke's lecture, he takes us on a deep dive into his research on Weddell seals. Keep watching to discover what we can learn about human biology and medicines by studying seals.
Wow, block 3 already. All right, let's get to studying them seals. So a couple of interesting facts about Weddell seals is they live to be about 30 years of age, and that as an adult, these animals can weigh somewhere between 400 and 600 kilograms, which is pretty big, and be around 2.5 to 3.5 meters long. And for most of us, that seems like a lot, but you can't really picture what that means. I like to think of it in terms of the Incredible Hulk. The Hulk is about 2.5 meters tall and weighs just over 600 kilograms. So the Incredible Hulk would be a really big Weddell seal. So maybe you could picture the Hulk like that. There we go. That makes it a little easier. Now, a big part of what we've been doing is trying to understand not only about seal biology, why seals have the ability to dive like this, how they have the ability to dive like this, but also what things can we learn from studying seal biology to help us with human biology, and in particular, medicines. One of the key things is that seals, like other marine mammals, can exercise while holding their breath, and they do it all the time, and they do it very well, and they don't develop the same diseases that we do as humans. And we know that as humans, we don't exercise while holding our breath very well, and often if we do that, we usually pass out. When we think about the tissues in our body, like our hearts and our brains, these tissues are particularly sensitive to lacking oxygen. So if our heart lacks oxygen or our brain lacks our oxygen, we can develop things like a heart attack or a stroke, because these parts of our body really need to have oxygen all the time, and when they don't, it's a real problem. If we can understand the tricks that the cells in the seal's body use to allow them to exercise without oxygen or function without oxygen, then maybe we can use that knowledge to help us develop better therapies for humans who might be at risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. In essence, we could develop medicines to protect people from having heart attacks and strokes. Seals have the big problem of exercising without oxygen. But the other thing is that when they dive, the greater the pressure is on your body. As you dive deeper and deeper, the pressure of that water pushing on the body squishes it more and more. And so those are two fundamental problems that the seal has to deal with as a deep diver. Well, one of the key objectives that we had as scientists who went down to study this was to understand how the muscle cells within the seal could function while holding their breath for a long period of time. And importantly, when these animals are born, they are born on the ice and they don't swim at all. We wanted to understand, do the muscle cells change as they go from a pup who just sits on the ice to an elite diving mammal? One of the important things you need to understand about seals is they are built for speed in the water. As you can see here, tracking down a seal to get muscle samples and blood samples from it was not terribly hard because they are like a giant slug. The other thing that we need to appreciate with these seals is that because they're in such a cold place, when they find a hole that they can come up out of the water with, they have to keep that hole open. And usually it's the male that will find a dive hole and will spend its time using its teeth and scratching out, and even sometimes its flippers, to scratch out the opening and keep it open, because if it leaves it for more than an hour or two, it will freeze completely shut and the animals will be stuck. I have a little video here that you can see the seal is in the dive hole and another seal is coming up to take a look. So we had a helmet cam on this seal, and now it's swimming up and it's heading up towards a dive hole, and you can see it's going to see some other seals here. Oh, there's some other seals at the dive hole. And you can hear them barking and chirping to each other. And in fact, those barks and chirps can be heard underwater for about 25 kilometers, so they can signal a long way to each other. Now here, this seal is coming up and probably saying, I would like to get a breath of air, and the other seal is saying, no way, I don't want you to use my hole. And so, in fact, they fight. You can see, oh, he got a breath, got another breath, and now he goes back down. Oh, we got one more breath, and now he's out. And so it's important to realize that these seals are not fighting to the death to keep their hole open, but they're protecting them and saying, I don't want any other males to come around here, these are mine. And the males will let the females come up and have their babies on the ice around them. Because seals are obviously mammals, they have lungs, and when they go to dive in for the first time, they will generally hyperventilate. And what does that mean? Breathing really quickly, deep breaths, trying to blow off all of their carbon dioxide and fill their body with oxygen. And then they take one last breath, and then they go underwater. Now, it's interesting that when you and I do that and we go underwater, we hold our breath and we don't blow it out very quickly. But in fact, the seals, when they go underwater, they will blow out all their air out of their lungs. For two reasons. Number one is because they don't want to be floating back up to the surface. They want to dive. And if they have air in their lungs, it's going to make them want to float. But the other thing that I was telling you about before is they have pressure. The pressure of the water pushing on their lungs helps to make them squeeze out all the air that's in their lungs. In essence, their lungs collapse. And so I know these graphs look a little complicated, but they're pretty simple actually. These are typical dives for a Weddell seal, an elephant seal, a bottlenose dolphin, and a blue whale. In these graphs, we are looking at how far down they dive. So here for the Weddell seal, they can go down to 600 meters, whereas a dolphin will only go around 120 meters. A blue whale, not very deep either. And an elephant seal, which actually can go very deep as well. But in typical dives, they'll go around 350 to 400 meters. These lines that we look at, there's black parts and there's red parts. And the black parts are where they are actively swimming, and the red parts are where they're just gliding. And you can see that many of these animals are going to try to use very little energy as they sink to the bottom where they want to go get their food. So even though they're going very deep or they're diving really far, they're not like you and I. If we wanted to swim to the bottom of our pool or to the bottom of the lake, we have to actively work really hard and then we kind of float back up. But that's because we have air inside our lungs. Here, they have blown all that air off and they sink to the bottom and they have to swim hard to come back up. My colleague, Dr. Canados, when they were down in Antarctica before our trip, they had actually taken Weddell seals and put helmet cams on them. And I showed you one video earlier of that. But here's a picture of what that helmet camera looks like. And this seal had actually got itself some lunch.
Cool!
In this video, you can actually see this Weddell seal sinking to the bottom, gliding to the bottom, looking for its lunch. Oh, it's found an octopus. And now it's just recognized that octopus, and the octopus is swimming away, and the seal now is actively chasing it. So it's using energy, it's using its oxygen stores to try to catch its lunch. And you can see it's really close now. Oh, you can see its mouth come wide open, and chomp. Big bite. Oh, it got the octopus. Marine mammals, like the seal, will do a few things to help it stay underwater longer. And these things, collectively, we call the dive response. The first thing it does is it slows its heart rate way down. And the other thing it does is it takes the little vessels that give blood to its muscles and it closes them right up so that they have very little blood going to the muscles. This is known as vasoconstriction. Now, this is the exact opposite of what you and I do when we exercise, right? When we exercise, we know our heart rate goes up and we increase the amount of blood that is going to our working muscles. And the reason that it wants to reduce the amount of blood that it's giving to those muscles is because there's other tissues which are much more sensitive to lacking oxygen. For example, our brain and our hearts. So a lot of blood is dedicated to going there. So we save the blood that we were going to give to the muscles and we give it to the brain and the heart. But that doesn't mean that the muscles aren't getting oxygen. In fact, They have a special secret that allows them to do this. If we zoom right into the muscle, and here we're just looking at the pectoral muscles of the animal. So this is a picture of a sea lion, not a seal. But you can see the pectoral muscle here, or the muscle in its chest. We're zoom right in, and inside these muscle cells is a special factor or a protein called myoglobin. When we were taking all of our deep breaths before we did our dive, we were hyperventilating. We were actually trying to fill up our oxygen sponge, the myoglobin, inside our muscle cells. And you might have heard of another type of globin that we have in our body that's in our blood called hemoglobin, right? Hemoglobin's actually what makes our blood red in color. It's like a sponge in our blood for oxygen. So blood goes to our lungs and the oxygen gets trapped in the hemoglobin and then it gets delivered to our body. And so the hemoglobin in the blood will give off its oxygen to the myoglobin in the muscle. So now our muscle is filled with oxygen, our sponge is full. But eventually there'll become a time where that sponge is empty of oxygen, right? The myoglobin has given up all the oxygen that it was saving, and essentially we've reached a point where we can't exercise with oxygen anymore. And we really do like that to exercise for a long time. And once we kind of run out of oxygen, we start to use a different kind of energy production called anaerobic respiration, and we can't do that for very long. It produces a lot of bad things for our body, and our body doesn't like it. And if you run slowly, you're using oxygen and there's no problem. But if you sprinted really, really quickly as fast as you could, you would be using anaerobic respiration. By doing that, you're going to build up things like lactate in your blood, which your body doesn't want to keep a lot of. So it will only let you sprint really fast for a small period of time. When the animal uses up its oxygen, we say it has reached its aerobic dive limit. It's used up all its oxygen and that's its time. It now needs to get back and take a breath. The longer it goes, the more time it has to take to recover. Just like if you ran really, really fast, it takes you a while to catch your breath again. But if you ran pretty easily and it wasn't very stressful, you could do it again right away. And that's what the seal likes to do. Now, once the seal gets back to the surface, those dive responses that it was doing, right, slowing its heart rate down and vasoconstricting, reducing the amount of blood to the muscles, that all changes. Now its heart rate goes really, really fast and it starts to breathe really quickly, getting rid of all of that carbon dioxide that was building up in its body. And it vasodilates. It opens up those blood vessels to the muscle and essentially wash the muscles with oxygen again and let all that myoglobin sponge fill back up again. And once it's recovered from that, then its heart rate will return to normal and the seal will be ready to dive again. Now, one of the challenges that we faced when we wanted to get a muscle and a blood sample from these animals, and when I say a muscle sample, I'm talking about a very little tiny piece, about the size of an eraser on the end of a pencil. So very, very small. So these animals weren't hurt at all. But the first thing we had to do was corral them. So we would put a hood on their head to make it seem like it was dark and calm them down. And then we would give them something to make them sleepy for a little while. Once they were sleeping, we could then weigh them. And you can see here, we have a seal here. This is going to be a juvenile seal. And we have our winch set up so we can weigh it. We would get a small piece of muscle and some blood sample. Here you can see the animal is waking back up again, and we had to stay with this animal to make sure it was safe, because the first thing it would want to do is go right back into its dive hole, but we didn't want the seal to go back into its dive hole while it was still feeling groggy and sleepy. So we would keep the animal outside of the dive hole until we were sure that it was safe to go back in. So the other thing we wanted to do was get juvenile seal samples, but where we were typically sampling, which would be down here in this area here and into the Delbridge Islands and the Erebus Ice Tongue. We would be getting the adults and the pups in this area. The juveniles or teenage seals aren't really allowed in here. They have to come up here, way up here in Wolfslag Bay usually, to where the ice edge is. The way to get there was by a helicopter. And one other thing I want to point out, here is Mount Erebus, the volcano, and there's a glacier coming off of Mount Erebus all the way down here, came all the way out onto the ice. This is referred to as the Erebus Ice Tongue. It's the glacier that comes out over to the ice. Here you can actually see the ice tongue. What I want you to notice here is you can see this ridge here. That ridge is where the tongue stuck out so far that it started to tilt forward and squish and break the ice, and so it would create cracks. And so we would often find seals at that area where the Erebus ice tongue was so heavy it was squishing the ice and creating cracks. And our job was to fly around and try to look for little black dots that we thought would be juvenile Weddell seals. And here you can see the Delbridge Islands and Mount Erebus in the background. We passed some great big icebergs that were frozen inside the ice. They don't look very big in this picture, but they are enormous. So here is a picture of me beside one of these icebergs. You don't stand there very long because if it calves or breaks, I could be crushed. And once we spotted a juvenile seal, we would have to land the helicopter far away from it so that we didn't scare it. After spotting it, we would land a long way away and then we would have to run to it. And one person was always designated as the runner, the person who would run really quickly and try to block the hole from the seal going back in while the rest of the team came with the equipment. And sometimes that was a long, long way. The runner here in this case was way ahead and the rest of us were coming with samples. So here we had caught in a juvenile seal, and this is what a juvenile seal looks like. It's just over 6 feet tall, weighing a few hundred pounds. So basically it looks like Dr. Trumbull here. The other funny thing I wanted to show you is that this was after we were done sampling, where the seal often will lie in the snow for a long period of time as it sits in the warm sun and gets all nice and toasty warm. It will actually start to melt into the ice. And so when it leaves, it actually leaves an indentation, kind of like a snow angel, but it's referred to as the seal shadow. But just like any other wild animal, if you get too close and you're not careful, it will try to protect itself. And that's what happened here. He got a little bit too careless and he got a little bit of a nip. And Weddell seals are not dangerous animals, and it was only afraid that he was going to do something. After we had sampled our juvenile seals, and this is just one, we were ready for cleanup. The seal was now awake and alert, and we let it head back off to its dive hole, and then we'd radio the helicopter to fly back in and pick us up. I think this is a great picture. You can see one of the icebergs in the background, but it's just nothing for miles and miles and miles. It is just ice. The easiest thing to get was the Weddell seal pups, the little babies. Very cute, very fuzzy, and they spend all of their time on the ice. So we didn't have to worry about pups diving into the holes, but we worried about the moms leaving them and when it was time to sample. We would use a little corral hut. You can see Dr. Trumbull and Dr. Canados weighing a Weddell seal pup, and we would take a small biopsy and a little bit of blood and then bring the pup back to the mom, and everybody was happy. And lots of things I could show you, but a couple of things that I really think are interesting. And a Weddell seal and a cow can weigh about the same amount. And if we look at how much muscle they have, that's not really very different, right? They're both about 150 kilograms of muscle. But what is very different is how the animals can store oxygen inside their body. So hemoglobin is kind of like that sponge inside your blood. Here is the cow's hemoglobin, and here's a Weddell seal hemoglobin. So more than double the amount of that sponge. The other important thing to note is that the Weddell seal has a lot more blood than the cow does. It has more blood and it has more sponge in that blood, so the amount of oxygen that the blood of that seal can hold is 30 liters versus about 5 liters or 4.5 liters. So a lot more oxygen can be stored in the blood. And then when we think about the muscle, even though it has the same amount of muscle, myoglobin, that sponge for oxygen inside the muscle, is much, much greater inside the seal, 54 versus 4. So a lot more of that myoglobin inside its muscle, meaning that it can hold a lot more oxygen inside its muscle, 11.4 versus 0.8. So when we think about how much total oxygen the Weddell seal can store inside its body, even when it's not breathing, is so much more than what we see in the cow. So these animals have figured out a way to be able to keep oxygen inside their body, even when they're not breathing. The machinery inside the cells that produces energy and produces energy from oxygen, so those are called the mitochondria. Those special things inside the cell are very evenly distributed, meaning that the myoglobin doesn't have very far to give off the oxygen to the special structures that need it. And that's unlike a lot of the other animals that are listed here, whether it be a goat or a calf or a pony or a fox. The Weddell seal and other marine mammals have lots of this mitochondria, and it's very evenly distributed so that the oxygen doesn't have to go very far. So we learned some really cool things when we were down there in Antarctica, and after 3 months we were finished all our sampling, and it was time to go home and back to the lab to do our analysis. But this time we didn't get to go on those really cool Globemaster planes. We had to go on these older Hercules aircraft. We had to sit inside a net. The trip home was exhausting, but it was an amazing experience. And so I want to finish off with a couple of challenge questions. We talked about this during the lecture today. How do Weddell seals keep their dive holes open? What do you call a female Weddell seal? And what do you call a male Weddell seal? A little fun one was, what do you call it when the seal spends so much time sunning itself on the ice that it melts into the ice? What was that indentation called? Who are Weddell seals named after? And then finally, I would like to thank my amazing colleagues that I went to Antarctica with, Dr. Shane Kanatos, who was the lead investigator and who invited me. That's Dr. Kanatos, Dr. Trumbull, who was my roommate, and then Dr. Hindle and Dr. Watson. I also encourage you very strongly to Google search the websites of Dr. Shane Kanatos at Colorado State University and Dr. Stephen Trumbull at Baylor University. These are amazing researchers who have tons of great pictures and tons of great stories on their website and links to take you to. Dr. Trumbull now is a world leader on whales and the stresses that whales face and how he uses earwax. Yeah, you heard me right, earwax to figure that out. And Dr. Kanatos and Dr. Trumbull are also doing some great things with leopard seals and elephant seals. So I encourage you to go to their websites and look at the amazing stuff that they're doing now. And with that, I will thank everybody for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day.
That concludes the third and final portion of Dr. Hawke's lecture. I know way more about Antarctica and seals now than I did before. But I'm a curious person, and I still have some questions for Dr. Hawke. I'm going to email my questions to Dr. Hawke at mcyu@mcmaster.ca, and you should too. Send in all of your questions, and Dr. Hawke will answer them in a video just for you. Bye for now. We would also like to take a moment to say a special thank you to our sponsors. Their support has made this program possible. And last but not least, we would especially like to thank you for coming out and learning with us.